Welcome back to Family Shadows, where stories of fathers, children, and the quiet echoes of love and loss come alive. If you find meaning in these tales, don't forget to gently tap subscribe, leave a comment, and share your thoughts. These stories aren't just mine, they are ours, reflections of what many of us carry in silence. Tonight's story is titled, "My son texted me to stay away from their mom, so I taught them what distance really means." Arthur Bennett was a man who had lived long enough to know that families rarely break with a bang. They splinter with whispers. They drift in the spaces between words left unsaid. They fracture in the distance between a hand extended and a hand withdrawn. He was 60 years old, a carpenter by trade, his palms still callous though the hammer had long since left his hand. Widowed once, estranged in quiet ways from the woman who had once been his partner, Arthur had learned to keep his life simple. A modest house at the edge of town, a workshop that smelled of cedar and dust, and a small, creased ledger where he kept track of bills and obligations, his own and, though few knew it, theirs. On a late autumn evening, as the last orange light of the sun slanted across the wood grain of his kitchen table, Arthur's phone buzzed. He thought little of it at first. Text messages these days came mostly from the pharmacy reminding him of prescriptions, or from his daughter Lily sending a picture of a meal she was proud to have cooked. Rarely, if ever, did his son Jake write anything. But that night the message was from Jake. Arthur tapped it open, and the words, black and blunt on a white background, tightened around his chest like a vice. "Dad, we need space with Mom. Please don't contact her anymore." He read it twice, then 3 times. Each time, the words did not soften. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that only widowers know. No voice in the other room to ask who's texting this late. No footsteps padding across linoleum, only the hum of the refrigerator and the creak of his own breath. Arthur set the phone on the table. He picked it up again. His thumb hovered over the keys. He typed, "Are you sure, son?" He deleted it, typed, "This isn't fair." Deleted again. Finally, he let the phone lie face down. He whispered aloud, as if the chair across from him were occupied. "Don't contact her anymore after all these years, after all I've done." His voice carried no anger, only a tired disbelief. Arthur and Diane had been married for 35 years. Their marriage had not ended in fire and fury, but in erosion. Too many arguments about money, too many silent nights where affection thinned like smoke. The divorce papers were signed in a courthouse without ceremony. Yet Arthur never stopped being present. When Diane's health wavered, it was Arthur who kept the insurance policy afloat. When her rent threatened to lapse, Arthur quietly signed as guarantor. He told no one. Not Jake, not Lily, not even Diane herself half the time. He simply paid as fathers do because love does not dissolve with ink on paper. Jake never knew the extent of it. Lily suspected but did not press. And now here was Jake declaring a boundary on behalf of his mother. Do not contact her anymore. Arthur's instinct was not to protest but to reflect. He had learned, through years of carpentry and parenting alike, that sometimes the harder you push, the more brittle the wood becomes. He walked into his workshop where sawdust still lingered in the air from projects left unfinished. He sat on the stool by his bench, the same stool he had occupied for decades. He stared at his hands. "Distance," he muttered. "That's what you want, son, distance." And then, slowly, painfully, he considered what that truly meant. Arthur remembered Jake as a boy, no older than 10, standing in this same workshop, asking, "Dad, why do you keep measuring twice before you cut?" Arthur had smiled, tousled his son's hair, and said, Because, son, once you cut, you can't uncut. You can't put the wood back. Those words returned to him now with cruel irony. Jake had measured nothing, it seemed. He had simply cut, severed contact, severed presence. And Arthur knew this was not a wound that could be glued together with apologies. Later that night, Arthur opened his ledger. The thin paper pages, smudged with pencil marks and coffee stains, carried years of entries. On one page, insurance premium $520, rent backstop $800, utilities forwarded $175. He traced each line with his finger like a man reading scripture. The ledger did not lie. It told a story of quiet provision, of burdens carried in secret. Arthur closed the book and rested his hand on the cover. He thought of the message again. Don't contact her anymore. Perhaps, he thought, it was time for the ledger to tell its story too. Morning came with a sharpness. The text message still glowed on his phone screen as though the night had conspired to etch it into permanence. Arthur made coffee, black and unsweetened, and sat by the window. Neighbors walked their dogs. Children biked past on their way to school. The world continued indifferent. But inside Arthur's chest something shifted. He would not fight the distance. He would honor it, but he would do so not with silence alone, but with a clarity that left no misunderstanding. Because if distance was what his children wanted, Arthur Bennett would teach them, once and for all, what distance really meant. Arthur did not answer the message. He had learned that silence could be louder than any reply. Instead, he poured his coffee into a thermos, slipped his ledger into the inner pocket of his jacket, and stepped out into the brisk November air. He drove past the streets he knew by heart, Elmwood, Maple, the curve where the road dipped toward the river. His truck, a faded blue Ford that coughed each time he turned the ignition, carried him not toward Diane's apartment as it usually did, but toward the grocery store. For years he had made that weekly detour, milk, bread, the special brand of tea she liked, tucked quietly on her porch with no note. It had been their unspoken rhythm. But this morning he drove past the store. He kept both hands tight on the wheel and told himself, she has her children. She doesn't need me. It was the first act of distance. At the post office, Arthur retrieved a stack of envelopes. Most bore his name. But there, wedged in between, was one with Diane's, forwarded by mistake, an overdue notice, the kind that came in red ink and sharp words. His instinct was immediate: slip it into his ledger, mark it for payment. That was what he had always done. But his son's words flickered in his mind. We need space with Mom. Don't contact her anymore. Arthur set the envelope aside. He would not pay it, not this time. He pressed it flat against the counter, breathed deeply, and walked out, the sound of the bell above the door jangling like a reprimand. That evening, he sat in his workshop with the envelope unopened. The air smelled of pine shavings and oil. His hands itched to reach for the phone, to call Diane, to tell her not to worry. He thought of the nights she had cried when the rent was late, of the way her voice trembled when the electricity threatened to be cut off. But he remained still. The chair creaked under his weight. He stared at the unfinished birdhouse on his bench, its edges rough, its corners sharp. He had promised Lily he would finish it for her classroom project. For now it stood as it was, half-built, silent, like the family that had once been whole. Days passed. The phone stayed silent. Diane did not call. Jake did not text again. Lily sent a picture of a sunset from her balcony, no mention of her mother, no question about him. Arthur let the days stretch out like planks on a bridge he wasn't sure he wanted to cross. He stopped by the pharmacy but canceled the automatic renewal on Diane's prescription plan. He called the insurance company and asked to remove himself as guarantor on the secondary policy. Each decision left a taste of metal in his mouth, as though he were chewing nails. The clerk on the other end of the phone asked, "Sir, are you sure? This will leave Mrs. Bennett solely responsible." Arthur swallowed. "Yes, that's the point." He hung up and sat in silence, the dial tone echoing in his head like a church bell. On Sunday morning, Arthur went to church alone. He chose a pew near the back. Father Lewis gave a sermon on letting go, on the discipline of stepping back so that others may learn to stand. Arthur listened, his head bowed, and thought of his children. He thought of Jake's face, stern and young, the same jawline Arthur saw each morning in the mirror. He thought of Diane's laugh, the one she hadn't shared in years. He thought of Lily, her gentle heart, the way she used to curl beside him on the couch as a girl, whispering secrets only a daughter tells her father. And he thought of the text, always the text. When the service ended, parishioners spilled into the cold morning. Arthur stayed in his seat until the church was nearly empty. He ran a hand over the worn wood of the pew and whispered, "If space is what they need, Lord, let me give it to them, but give me the strength to keep my hand steady while they learn what that means." By the second week, the ripples of his withdrawal began to show. Jake called not to Arthur but to Lily. She mentioned it in passing when she dropped off a bag of apples from her garden. "Jake's been upset," she said, fiddling with the strap of her purse. "Mom's worried about the bills. She said the phone company shut off her line yesterday. Jake thinks you well. He thinks you're pulling away." Arthur looked at his daughter, her eyes soft, uncertain. He wanted to tell her the truth, that he had carried them all for years, that the phone she spoke of had rung because of him, that the lights had stayed on because his calloused hands had written the checks, but he only nodded. "Sometimes," he said slowly, "the best way to love someone is to step back." Lily tilted her head, searching his face. "But Dad, do you really think they'll understand?" Arthur forced a thin smile. "One day, maybe not now, but one day." She didn't argue. She only hugged him tighter than usual before leaving. That night, Arthur opened his ledger again. He drew 2 columns with his pencil, continue and stop. Under continue, he wrote, "Lily's student loan top-up, property tax on my own house, grocery money for myself." Under stop, he wrote, "Diane's rent backstop, insurance premiums, phone bill, medical co-pays." The pencil hesitated before each entry, his hand trembling as though each word were a cut into wood he could never uncut. But when he finished, the lines were firm, the handwriting steady. He closed the book, turned off the light in the workshop, and sat in the dark. The silence was heavy, but it was his silence, chosen, deliberate. The first lessons of distance were taking shape. Arthur's phone had always been a lifeline, first to the children when they were small, later to the wider circle of family, and most recently, to Diane whenever something in her life began to wobble. But as days turned into weeks, the phone grew strangely silent. At first, he thought nothing of it. People were busy. Jake had his job at the firm. Lily was working extra shifts at the school. Diane's health, fragile as it was, often kept her in bed. But when the silence stretched on, no calls, no questions, not even the courtesy of a voicemail, Arthur sensed the invisible hand of his son tightening around the family's lines of communication. One Thursday morning, Arthur drove to the hospital to renew his own prescription. He carried his folder of papers, as he always did, organized neatly in an old leather satchel. At the reception desk, he asked if Diane had been in for her checkup. He phrased it casually, the way one might ask about the weather. The young woman behind the counter, polite but firm, clicked at her computer and said, "I'm sorry, sir, but you're not listed as an emergency contact anymore. I can't give you information." Arthur blinked. "That can't be right. I've been on her file for years." She checked again, eyes darting with a trace of discomfort. "It was updated last week. Her son, Jake Bennett, is listed as the sole contact." Arthur's lips pressed into a thin line. He nodded slowly. "I understand." He walked out of the building with his satchel heavier than before, though the papers inside had not changed. Outside, the autumn air felt colder, the wind sharper. He realized what Jake had done, erected a fence, a gate through which every word to Diane must pass. That evening, Arthur sat at his workbench, turning a piece of cedar between his fingers. The grain ran straight and strong, but there was a knot near the center. He traced it with his thumb. That's what families do, he thought. They grow straight until someone decides to bend the grain, and once it bends, it never runs smooth again. 2 nights later, Lily came by. She carried a casserole dish, steam rising from the foil lid, and set it on his table. "Dad," she began cautiously, "Jake thinks you're making things harder for Mom. He says she's confused, that she feels abandoned." Arthur didn't answer right away. He removed the lid, let the aroma of baked pasta fill the kitchen, and only then looked at his daughter. "Abandoned," he repeated softly. "After all these years." Lily lowered her eyes. "I'm just telling you what he said. He thinks maybe it's best if you step back completely." Arthur gave a short, quiet laugh. "Step back, Lily. I've been stepping back for 30 years. Every time your mother needed something, I was the one making sure she didn't stumble. And Jake, he never even saw it. He only sees me now because I've stopped holding the net." Lily winced, torn between loyalty to her brother and love for her father. He thinks he's protecting her. Arthur's voice grew firmer. Protecting her from what? From the man who's paid her bills, kept her safe, carried her when no one else would. If that's protection, then maybe what he's building isn't a shield, it's a wall. The room fell silent except for the hum of the refrigerator. Lily reached across the table, squeezed his hand gently, and whispered, "I believe you, Dad, but Jake, he won't listen." Arthur looked at his daughter, at the lines of worry etched into her forehead, and felt both gratitude and grief. She was trying, but even she was caught in the gate Jake had built. The following week, the hospital called, not him, but Lily. Diane had suffered a dizzy spell during a checkup. They needed someone to drive her home. Lily texted her father afterward, apologizing. "Jake asked me not to bother you. He said he'd handle it." Arthur stared at the message, the words burning, "Not to bother you," as if his love, his concern, his presence were nothing but a nuisance. He walked into his workshop and opened his ledger again. On the last page he wrote in firm block letters, "Distance begins where gates are built." And then he underlined it twice. The days turned into a kind of exile. Diane's birthday came and went with no invitation. Holidays were planned without his knowledge. He saw pictures on Lily's social media. Diane smiling faintly at a dinner table, Jake's arm around her shoulder, Lily sitting close. The caption read, "Family time." Arthur stared at the photo on his computer screen. His chest ached, not from jealousy, but from the realization that in their eyes, family now meant something he was no longer part of. He leaned back in his chair, closed his eyes, and whispered to the empty room, "If family is only a word used at convenience, then maybe it's time I remind them what it costs to exclude someone who's been carrying the weight all along." Thus, the gate was built, and Arthur, for the first time in his life, decided he would not push against it. He would let it stand, tall and proud, until those on the other side learned what walls can do, not only to keep people out, but to keep them in. Arthur woke before dawn, as he always had. Old habits clung to him the way the scent of sawdust clung to his clothes. The house was quiet, still wrapped in shadows, when he brewed his coffee and carried it into the workshop. He laid the ledger on the bench, its cover worn soft by years of his hand. The little book was nothing fancy, just a lined journal from the stationery aisle. But inside it, Arthur had kept the truth of his family. Every bill, every payment, every sacrifice that had gone unseen lived between its pages. That morning he opened to a fresh sheet. He drew 2 lines with his carpenter's pencil, dividing the page into 2 columns, continue and stop. He paused, staring at the paper, feeling the weight of what the pen strokes would mean. Once the words were written, they were like cuts in wood, final, irreversible. The first entry under continue was easy, property tax on my own home. The house was his shelter, his last stronghold. Then he wrote, Lily's student loan top-up, a small sum he still sent quietly each month, never mentioning it. She didn't ask for it anymore, but Arthur knew teachers didn't earn much, and pride sometimes kept her from admitting what she needed. Then came the harder part. Under stop, he hesitated before writing, Diane's rent guarantee. The pencil hovered, his hand trembling. He thought of the time she had called him in tears, terrified she'd lose the roof over her head. He had always stepped in, always steadied the ground beneath her. But now, the text echoed in his mind, please don't contact her anymore. The pencil touched paper, he wrote the words. Next, phone bill, the family plan had always been in his name. Jake's number, Lily's, even Diane's, all tied together under the umbrella of his quiet provision. For years he had told them it was cheaper that way. It wasn't about money, it was about keeping them tethered. Now, he pressed the pencil down harder, carving the word stop into the page. And finally, medical co-pays, insurance premiums. These were the heaviest. His insurance had covered not only his own prescriptions but Diane's as well. Removing himself meant she would face the full burden. He closed his eyes, whispered a prayer for her health, and wrote it anyway. By the time the sun edged through the blinds, the page was filled. Arthur set the pencil down and rubbed his eyes. The decision felt both devastating and liberating. He reached for the phone, dialed Ms. Carter, the family lawyer who had handled his divorce years ago. Her voice was steady, professional, and yet kind when she answered. Arthur, it's been a while, she said. Yes, he replied. Too long, maybe, but I need your help again. She listened as he explained how he wanted to restructure his finances, update his will, remove his name from guarantees he had quietly held for years. He did not mention the text from Jake, did not confess the ache in his chest. He spoke only of decisions as if they were business. When he finished, Ms. Carter was quiet for a moment. Then she said softly, Arthur, this isn't just about money, is it? He swallowed. No, it's about distance, and I intend to respect it. Later that afternoon, Arthur drove to the insurance office. The clerk, a young man in a suit too big for him, tapped at his keyboard. Are you sure you want to remove yourself as guarantor, Mr. Bennett? Arthur nodded. This will leave Mrs. Bennett fully responsible for her share if anything happens. I know, Arthur interrupted gently. It's her responsibility now. The clerk hesitated, then clicked. It's done. Arthur walked out of the building with the autumn wind brushing against his face. The world looked the same, but something inside him had shifted. He had cut ties, not out of malice, but out of obedience to his son's command, to his own resolve. That evening he cooked himself a simple dinner, roast chicken, potatoes, a glass of red wine. He set one plate, one fork, one glass. The table had once held 4, then 3, then 2. Now it was only him. As he ate, he thought about Diane's birthday just days away. In the past, he would have left flowers at her door, maybe slipped a check into a card. This year, he would not. Instead, he folded a letter, sealed it in an envelope, and placed it in his desk drawer. On the front, he wrote, "To Jake, Lily, and Diane. Do not open until we're all together." It was not a love letter. It was not an apology. It was a record of decisions, a declaration of distance made visible. Arthur closed the drawer, turned off the lights, and stood in the doorway of his workshop. The ledger lay open on the bench, its pages filled with choices that would ripple through his family like stones in water. He whispered to the empty room as though his children were listening. "You ask me for space. You will have it, but space has weight, and one day you'll feel it." And with that, he climbed the stairs to bed, the echo of his footsteps the only sound in the house. Diane's birthday fell on a Saturday that year. The town was dressed in late November chill, trees stripped bare, shop windows filled with garlands that hinted at Christmas. For decades, Arthur had marked that day in quiet ways. A bouquet of lilies left on the porch, a warm coat bought when she wouldn't buy it for herself, a check folded into a card with nothing more than "Happy Birthday." But this year, he did not drive to the florist. He did not step into the stationery aisle. Instead, he sat in his workshop that morning, the envelope already sealed, the letter inside waiting for its moment. He rubbed the paper between his hands as though it were wood he could sand smooth. The weight of it seemed larger than it was, heavier than a single folded sheet. It carried the history of every sacrifice unspoken, every ledger entry written in the quiet of his nights. By evening, Jake's house filled with voices. Laughter echoed through the windows. Balloons bobbed against the ceiling. Diane sat at the head of the table, a paper crown crooked on her head. She smiled, though Arthur, had he been there, would have known the smile was thin, fragile as porcelain. But Arthur was not there. Instead, at precisely 7 o'clock, the doorbell rang. When Jake opened it, he found not his father but M.S. Carter holding a plain manila folder and the white envelope marked, "To Jake, Lily, and Diane." Jake frowned. "What's this?" "M.S." Carter offered a small smile, her presence steady, unshaken by the noise of the party. "Arthur asked me to deliver this tonight. He said it was important that you all read it together." Jake muttered something under his breath, displeasure curling at the edge of his mouth. But Diane, curious, reached for the envelope with careful fingers. She recognized Arthur's handwriting instantly, strong, deliberate, each letter drawn as though carved. "Let's open it," she said quietly. The music lowered, conversation ebbed. Lily set her fork down, her heart thudding. She had known her father was planning something, though she hadn't guessed what. Diane unfolded the letter. The paper trembled slightly in her hands. Her eyes moved slowly across the words, her lips parting as she read aloud. "To my children, and to the woman I once called my partner, you ask me for distance. Tonight I give it to you, not in anger, not in revenge, but in respect for your wish. For years I have stood behind the curtain, paying the bills that kept lights on, the premiums that kept doctors near, the rent that kept a roof above. I asked for nothing in return but the peace of knowing you were safe. Those days are over. The ledger is closed. From this month forward, you will walk on your own 2 feet. You will learn what it costs to live without the quiet hand you never saw but always leaned on." Diane's voice faltered. The room was so still that the tick of the wall clock seemed deafening. She continued, "Do not mistake this for cruelty. I have left a cushion, 3 months' rent already paid. The insurance plan I carried has been shifted into a separate account in Diane's name alone for you to manage. And my estate, when the time comes, will no longer be divided by habit but by principle. It will flow into a scholarship in your mother's name so that your children and theirs will remember her not through conflict but through opportunity. Jake's jaw tightened. He had no right. But Diane silenced him with a raised hand. Her eyes, damp now, traced the final lines. I have nothing left to give but truth. And the truth is this: distance is not silence. It is a mirror. In this mirror, you will see what you are without me. If one day you wish to speak, not about money, not about blame, but about respect, you will find me in my workshop. Until then, this is goodbye. Signed simply, Arthur Bennett. The silence after the letter was heavier than any argument. Diane set the paper down, her fingers trembling. Lily blinked back tears, her chest tight with conflicting loyalties. Jake broke first. He thinks he can just walk away. After everything, he's abandoning her, abandoning us. Lily shook her head. No, Jake, he's not abandoning us. He's finally letting go. Diane sat back in her chair, the paper crown slipping slightly to one side. She looked older in that moment, as though the letter had carved years into her face. But beneath the sadness in her eyes there was something else, something like recognition. She whispered almost to herself, "He was always the one, I never saw how much." Outside, the night pressed against the windows. The party felt suddenly hollow, the laughter gone flat, the balloons bobbing without purpose. The letter lay in the center of the table, stark as a gravestone. No one reached for cake. No one sang. The birthday had been interrupted not by noise but by truth. And in his workshop across town, Arthur sat alone, hands folded, eyes closed. He did not need to be there to know what was happening. He had built houses all his life. He understood structure. Tonight he had removed the foundation. He knew the walls would tremble. But sometimes walls had to tremble before people learned what held them up. The letter lingered on the table for days after the party, as though no one dared to move it. Diane tucked it into her purse eventually, but the words clung to her like smoke. Each time she reached for her wallet, her fingers brushed against Arthur's handwriting, and she felt the ground shift beneath her. The first ripples of distance arrived quietly, like winter frost creeping over a window pane. On Monday morning, Diane picked up her phone to call the pharmacy. A polite, automated voice answered. "This number is no longer active. Please contact your service provider." She frowned, tried again, then realized her phone was dead, not out of battery but out of connection. The family plan, once invisibly upheld by Arthur's steady payments, had been severed. Jake stormed into the living room an hour later, waving his own phone in the air. "My line's been cut too. Can you believe this? He just shut us off." Lily, sitting at the kitchen table with her laptop, looked up slowly. "He warned us," she said. "He wrote it right there. The plan ends this month." Jake's face burned red. He can't just, but he could. He already had. 2 weeks later, another letter arrived. This one was from the landlord. "Notice of adjustment. Mr. Arthur Bennett is no longer listed as guarantor. Please ensure payment directly." Diane sat at the kitchen table, the paper trembling in her hands. "I don't know if I can do this," she whispered. "Rent, insurance, utilities, I can't carry it all." Jake paced the room. "We'll figure it out. I'll take extra hours. Maybe we can." He stopped himself. Pride weighed heavily on his tongue. Asking Arthur for help was no longer an option, not after the letter, not after the silence. Lily, quiet until then, spoke softly. "Maybe this is what Dad meant. Maybe it's time we stop leaning on him without even knowing it." Jake turned sharply. "You're taking his side now." "I'm not taking sides," Lily said, her voice trembling. "I'm just starting to see." Meanwhile, across town, Arthur felt the shift too. Not in phone calls, they no longer came, but in the way his workshop grew quieter each night. He no longer rushed to the bank to cover Diane's overdue notices, no longer answered late-night calls about broken heaters or unpaid bills. Instead, he poured his energy into wood, birdhouses, shelves, a rocking chair he had promised himself he'd build years ago. Each cut of the saw, each stroke of sandpaper was a reminder. His hands were his own again. But solitude, even chosen, has a weight. At night, when he turned off the light in his workshop, the silence pressed heavy on his chest. He would sit in the dark, listening to the creak of the old house, and wonder if distance, once created, could ever be bridged again. The true weight came one evening when Jake showed up at his door. The knock was sharp, impatient. Arthur opened it to find his son standing stiff, his jaw set. "We need to talk," Jake said flatly. Arthur stepped aside. The workshop smelled of pine, and Jake glanced around as though seeing it for the first time, as though realizing how much of his father's life had been spent here. "You've made your point," Jake began. "Mom's struggling. Her phone's gone, the rent's due. The insurance," he broke off, shaking his head. "You can't just leave her like this." Arthur studied his son. The same eyes, the same brow, the same stubborn fire he once had as a young man. "I didn't leave her," Arthur said quietly. "I left space. You told me to, and now you're learning what that means." Jake's hands clenched into fists. "That's not fair." Arthur's voice stayed calm, but each word carried weight. "Fairness isn't the issue, respect is. You cut me out, Jake. You built the gate, and gates don't just keep people out, they keep responsibility in." For the first time, Jake faltered. His anger softened into something else, fear maybe, or recognition. He looked around the workshop, at the ledger lying open on the bench. Pages filled with numbers, years of quiet provision. He realized, perhaps for the first time, how much his father had carried. He looked back at Arthur, but no words came. Arthur didn't push. He only gestured to the chair across the bench. "Sit, son. If you want to understand, sit." But Jake shook his head, turned, and left. The door closed behind him with a thud that echoed in Arthur's chest long after the footsteps faded. That night, Arthur sat at his workbench long past midnight. He opened the ledger, ran his fingers across the lines, and whispered to himself, "Distance isn't silence, it's truth." And in that truth, he knew, the lesson had only just begun. The knock came on a Sunday afternoon, softer this time. Not the angry pounding of a son demanding answers, but the tentative rapping of someone unsure of what waited on the other side. Arthur opened the door to find both his children standing there. Jake's shoulders were stiff, but his eyes betrayed a weariness he hadn't carried weeks before. Lily clutched her purse to her chest, her face pale, her mouth pressed thin as though she'd rehearsed words but lost them on the drive over. Arthur stepped back and let them in. The workshop was warm with the scent of cedar and varnish. Sunlight filtered through the dust, turning every mote into a suspended star. On the workbench lay the ledger, its spine cracked open, pages covered in neat columns of pencil marks. Jake's gaze fell on it immediately. "That book," he said, his voice low, "that's what you've been writing in." Arthur pulled out a stool and sat down. He gestured to the other chairs. "Sit, both of you. If you want to know, you'll have to read." Reluctantly, Jake and Lily settled into the chairs. The silence between them hummed like the tension of a violin string. Arthur turned the ledger toward them. His finger tapped gently against the pages. "These numbers," he said, "are the story of this family. Rent payments, insurance premiums, utility bills, prescriptions, All the things you thought just worked out, they didn't. I carried them. Jake's jaw tightened. Why didn't you tell us? Arthur looked at his son steadily. Because love doesn't always need an invoice. Because a father's job is to carry until his children can stand on their own. But somewhere along the way, carrying turned into enabling. You stopped seeing me as a man and started seeing me as a service. And then, when you thought you didn't need me anymore, you told me to stay away. Jake flinched, his eyes dropping to the floor. Lily reached for the ledger, her fingers trembling as she traced the entries. She read aloud softly. July 14th, hospital copay $320. August 2nd, insurance premium $520. September 10th, rent guarantee $800. She looked up, her eyes wet. Dad, this is years of your life. Arthur nodded. And I don't regret it, but I won't do it anymore, not when respect has been cut out of the equation. The room grew quiet again. Outside, the wind rattled the leaves against the siding. Jake shifted in his chair, his voice softer now. I thought I was protecting Mom. I thought if you stepped back, she'd feel safer. Arthur leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. Protecting her from what? From the man who kept her afloat, from the only one who never stopped showing up. Son, you built a gate, but you didn't see what it would cost. Gates don't just keep people out, they keep you trapped inside with the weight you never noticed before. Jake's hands curled into fists, then loosened. His eyes glistened, though he blinked hard against it. Lily finally spoke, her voice steady though her throat tightened. Dad, I don't want this distance anymore. Not like this. I miss you. Arthur reached across the bench and laid his hand over hers. Then come back, Lily. Not to the old way where I carried everything in silence. Come back to something honest where respect goes both ways. Jake stood suddenly, pacing the room. He picked up a small carving knife from the bench, turning it over in his hand. You make it sound so simple, but what if it's too late? What if we already ruined it? Arthur's gaze softened. Wood splits when you cut it wrong, but if you sand it carefully, if you take your time, you can still make it into something strong. Families are no different. The question isn't if it's too late. The question is whether you're willing to put in the work. Jake set the knife down. For the first time in weeks, his shoulders sagged, the fire in his eyes dimming into something more human. I don't know if I can fix it, but I don't want this wall between us anymore. Arthur nodded slowly. That's a start. The three of them sat in the workshop as the light faded. No one said much after that. They didn't need to. Sometimes reconciliation doesn't begin with grand speeches. It begins with the simple act of sitting in the same room, breathing the same air, and deciding quietly that the wall no longer needs to stand. And as the last of the sunlight slipped through the window, catching the sawdust in golden streams, Arthur thought, perhaps distance had finally taught its lesson. The days after that meeting in the workshop were quiet, but not the heavy silence of before. It was a quieter kind of hope, like the air after a storm when the sky is still gray but you can smell the freshness of rain. Arthur continued his routines, coffee at dawn, woodwork in the afternoons, long walks through town at twilight. Yet something had shifted. He no longer carried the gnawing weight of resentment. The letter had been written, the truth spoken. Now whatever came would come honestly. One evening, as he sanded the edges of the rocking chair he'd been building, his phone buzzed. He expected another pharmacy reminder, perhaps a notice from the bank. Instead, it was a message from Lily. Dad, can we come by tomorrow, just us? No Mom, no big talk, just dinner. Arthur read it twice. His heart, worn but steady, felt a spark of warmth. He typed back simply, yes, bring nothing but yourselves. The next evening, the three of them gathered at Arthur's kitchen table. There was no ledger on the counter, no letters waiting in drawers, only a roast chicken, a bowl of mashed potatoes, and 3 plates. Lily laughed softly when she saw the spread. "You haven't changed," she said. Arthur smiled. "Some things aren't meant to." Jake sat stiffly at first, unused to the new terrain between them. But as the meal went on, the edges of his defensiveness softened. He asked about the rocking chair, about the birds that nested in Arthur's yard, about small things that fathers and sons talk about when the bigger things are too heavy. They did not solve everything that night. They didn't need to. Healing, Arthur knew, wasn't about erasing scars. It was about learning to live with them and letting them remind you of where not to cut again. Later, as they stood to leave, Jake hesitated at the door. His hand rested on the knob, but his voice was low. "Dad," he said, "I'm sorry for that text. I thought I was doing right by Mom. I didn't realize what I was cutting away." Arthur looked at his son, the same boy who once asked why you measure twice before you cut. He stepped forward and placed a hand on Jake's shoulder. "Now you know," Arthur said gently. "Distance can protect, but it can also wound. What matters is knowing when it's needed and when it's only pride." Jake nodded, his throat tight. "I don't want that kind of distance anymore." Arthur gave his shoulder a squeeze. "Then don't build gates where doors should be." When the house was quiet again, Arthur stood in the doorway of his workshop. The rocking chair gleamed softly in the lamplight. He imagined one day sitting there with a grandchild in his arms, telling stories not of bitterness, but of endurance and love. He whispered into the silence as though to the very walls. A father's love isn't measured in bills paid or sacrifices hidden. It's measured in the respect that grows when children finally see the weight he carried. And if it takes distance for that respect to be found, then so be it. And so, dear friends, this chapter of Family Shadows comes to a close. Thank you for listening, for walking with us through the silence, the distance, and the rediscovery of what it means to be a family. May you find strength in your own homes, patience in your own struggles, and respect in the ties that bind you. I wish you and your families health, happiness, and the kind of love that endures every storm. Until next time, take care of yourselves and of each other.